All right, we're on now. So, again, thanks for being here, John. We're very excited to have you as our guest speaker on our very first episode of this podcast. How are you feeling today?
Thank you, Gary. I'm feeling very good. It's good to be here.
Are there, I mean, you already have a vague idea of like what this project of ours is about. Um, alongside you, we're hoping to interview other philosophers and psychologists on the topic of transformative experiences.
Yeah.
And I guess it'll be sort of like a video anthology on human transformation. And you being our first guest speaker, what we want to actually do is get some of the conceptual like labor in to set a sort of frame for all the discussions that will follow later on.
I'm happy
Um,
to do that. That'd be great.
all right. So there's two things that come to my mind. The first is I guess I'll start on a more personal note since we're already having this conversation. So um, I mean, this is one thing that your students always say that you have transformed their lives through your courses, through your teachings, and I felt this firsthand being a student of yours in several courses back in my undergrad, and now we're also collaborating on some work together, which is
Yeah,
really awesome for me.
it
Um,
is. I love it.
I'm yeah, I guess I could keep this open ended and ask you like on the topic of human transformation, how does your pedagogy like factor into that concept? Uh,
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm doing a lot of work on that right now, especially with Leo Ferraro. I guess for me, I'll start with things that sound trite, but then there's some heavy conceptual lifting behind them. Um, I've placed an emphasis on, and there's even a branch of research called transformative learning, transformative teaching, where this is made central. And so the idea, I mean, for me, the central kind of cognitive transformation you can bring in a class, and then I'll talk about what you can bring in a course, are moments of Socratic insight, where people get an and this is going to be the key term, where they get a profound understanding in a way that is in some sense relevant to them, that matters to them. So if I can take them into a topic and first of all deeply challenge their common sense intuitions. So often what I do is if I'm going to teach something, I'll set up a problem, and then I'll bring up all of the intuitive, sort of, or even technical answers people are aware of. You can see Socrates doing this in the dialogues. And what Socrates always is doing is he's challenging the unchallenged authority of common sense intuition, the first person sort of bias, first person perspective bias, and he's also challenging a third person sort of technical authority. Well, blah blah says this or blah blah says that, and he challenges both of those, right? Because both of those don't involve us engaging with the material in a transformative fashion. We have suffered since the Middle Ages at a particular loss. I mean, up until the late Middle Ages, it was thought that some of the most central truths, that's a contested term, so we can talk about that later, but some of the
yeah.
most central truths that human beings can come into relationship can only be achieved through radical transformation. So the idea was, right, that there, that you didn't come in with sort of the idea of a self-enclosed, sufficiently educated, sufficiently positioned, poised mind. You had to go through radical transformation. Of course, this is in Socrates, and what you often therefore have to challenge, right, is again the the presupposition that is culturally reinforced that people bring, that they don't have to undergo transformation for deep learning. And so what I try to do is set up a problem and then bring up sort of common sense or, technical solutions to it,
Yep. Yep.
and then undermine them, right? And then, and intensify the problem until people, right, get sort of,
Right.
ah, right? And you take people to the, what, and Socrates said, wisdom begins in wonder. You take people into wonder, not just in the Aristotelian sense of curiosity, but in the sense of on the edge of awe. And then when an insight occurs, because it's insight in response to wonder. See, wonder is that state in which you're willing, it's different from curiosity in that you're willing to call yourself and your world into question.
Right.
And then if you get people to have insight within wonder, then they often will go through the transformation that is needed to
Okay.
to get certain kinds of
Right.
understanding.
Right. So let me ask you two questions there that come up for
Sure.
me. One of the things that is most salient to me about your approach is that it's like your arguments are they're embedded in a larger sort of narrative. It's like
Yeah.
storytelling that's
Yeah. Yeah.
the medium, right, of
Yeah.
transformation in this sense. So I'm curious about the phenomenology of it, like the lived experience of learning through storytelling and teaching through storytelling.
Well, what I
Um,
try to do actually, Gary, is I try to integrate the two together. In fact, this is something I teach when I'm teaching graduate students in teaching. I say, what you're trying to do is you're trying to integrate it. You're trying to integrate narrative and argumentation together. And so typically what I do is instead of presenting ideas or theories, I present sort of a narrative of debate. And what I
right,
try to get people seeing is the fallibilism of any position, and then
right.
and encountering there's anxiety around that, and then but giving them also the sense of wonder, and then the insights. And so the phenomenology, I mean, that's an excellent question. What's most prominent in my mind is that I am trying to get into a place that is often even a flow state in which
Mhm.
I am I'm sharing the learning experience rather than pronouncing like information to people.
Ooh,
I'm
okay.
actually trying to relive. And what often happens is and
Reenact the process of
yeah,
transformation.
but even more
Right.
than reenact, it's the analogy I often use is jazz. Like I have a script, right? But I'm jazzing on the script. I try to
Okay,
get into a state so that when I'm
I
getting
see.
the narrative insights, I get new insights. I get fresh
Okay,
insights.
okay.
And so often some of the points that most like sort of open my eyes,
Yep.
I'm actually coming to them in the lecture as I'm lecturing.
Right, right. Okay, so it's less about mimicking your past self and more about bringing reinstantiating that like spark of vitality that kind of shows up when you're in touch with that in that flow state of learning.
Exactly, exactly. It's and like jazz, right? You're playing from your audience, right? You have to. So that's where a lot of mindfulness training and psychotherapeutic training also has come to my aid because like sort of picking up on how people are responding and getting very having a
So
lot of cognitive flexibility.
So about that, my next question, which you just kind of brought me back to, was going to be about safety, actually, feelings of security, because transformation can be a very precarious and
Yeah,
threatening
yeah,
process. And as someone who's continually engaged in facilitating the process of human transformation, at least through teaching and learning, I'm wondering how you see question or the theme of safety emerging and fitting into this process
very
from
much.
the teacher's perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so so first of all, I spend well, you've been in some of my courses. I spend the first class like discussing with people, what the culture of the classroom is going to be like, and that I need like that I often ask people, give me some indication what kind of question you're asking. Are you asking a clarification question or a challenge
Yeah.
question, right? Uh, and that I, 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 I really get people to focus on the process rather than their product. So if they start to say, this is probably a stupid question, I interrupt them and say, don't do that, right? Don't do that because first of all, a lot of other people around you were probably having a similar question and now you're making them feel stupid, right? And don't do that. So and often if people, so I even make people feel, fine with having a relatively incoherent idea and speaking it, and I help to draw them out. And I often take some time to make sure that I've understood them before I'll launch into any critical response. And I try to convey two things all the time: gratitude and respect, for that participation, and also that they have a sense of humility from me, right? That I'm not, oh, I know, and oh, you're so silly, student. It's no, like I often try to get a sense of like we're in this together. I'm gonna be your guide. I get that, but I want everybody to feel like they're getting involved.
So, thank you so much for sharing all that. The moment you said humility, right, trying to make it apparent or visible that you're embodying a sense of humility through your process of teaching. I thought to myself that, well, where does that come from? How did that principle for you emerge historically as you were developing as a teacher? And of course, I assumed, maybe I even project a little bit, that um, you know, as a teacher, someone who's naturally in a position of authority and who's also, uh, quite fluent in the realm of ideas and with language, it could be very easy to come off as intimidating or
Yeah, yeah.
off-putting. And I'm wondering two things. One, how that played out in your experience, your own personal process of transformation with that psychologically, what it is you had to work through and work with. And two, what would you say to people who are still struggling with these themes, like myself, for example? I'm going to be teaching my third course just this semester, so I'm relatively new to the process of teaching in a university context. So these themes are definitely relevant for me, and I'm sure others too. Um, those are my two questions for you.
Those are good questions. I mean, um, so the issue of humility is something that has been impressed upon me uh, primarily by my lack of it. And so, I
Hmm.
mean, I have, you're now seeing me decades in, but, um, I thought I had a lot of feedback about being arrogant and intimidated. And this caused significant cognitive dissonance in me because it was deeply
Hmm.
inconsistent with the Socratic ideal that I aspired to. And so, and then I had some experiences, personal experiences, which I won't go into, in which
Hmm.
it was clear that it became clear to me that was bravado, that was an attempt to silence through intimidation possible challenge or criticism so that I didn't have to face that anxiety. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
and then I realized that, and that did in fact impress a lot of people. But I also realized that it was, I mean, no matter how good a teacher you are, there's just going to be some people who don't like you. You just have to accept that.
Yeah.
But then I started to realize that there's people that should, to my mind, should have been, because you can tell what they're coming to the class with, should be resonating with the class, and they were being put off uh, by that. And like I said, and I also saw some of my personal relationships suffer at the hands of that kind of defensive self-centeredness. Um, and so I undertook, and I'm still undertaking. I think it's always going to be a challenge for me. Uh, but it's funny that we have the connection, but we forget the connection between humility and being humiliated. Um, and, um, and there's a positive, there are, there are positive instances of humiliation in one's life where one realizes that one has been a fool or one has been vicious in some fashion precisely because of a lack of humility. And so, because of all of those things, they all converge together for me to make that a very deep and important virtue that I aspire to. I mean, I do practices every day to aspire to it. And I try to exemplify it, and I mean, all the work I'm doing on dialectic and dialogos, I'm trying to bring this, into my interactions with people. And so learning to take, not just take, because that sounds just oppositional, but take to heart good criticism. You have to be discerning, right? Because there's trolls. There's people that are just like that, right? But
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
good faith criticism, take it to heart. And that what that means is treat it like an insight that you had, and how would it change your behavior? And also try to listen for the possibility of insight from other people. And then, because then the jazz becomes shared and it becomes better jazz. So those are things I'm trying to do all the time. And I just don't want, I'm also getting older, and I, I mean, I just want to be kinder to people in general.
Thank you for sharing all that. I, I I found myself listening to what you were sharing, resonating with a lot of it actually, and part of what I felt that came up for me that I was in touch with there was that um, it's not simple because there's always like the obvious side to what's happening, and there's the shadow side of it,
Yeah,
the part that's being concealed, right? And
yeah,
I feel that part of the defensiveness of you know, I guess adopting a mindset of arrogance when it comes to the context of teaching or um, something that is a core sort of source of existential meaning for a person. In this case, you and myself as well. You've known me for I guess about 8 years now, actually.
yeah. Right.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd be curious to hear your perspective on my development actually in the last 8 years as one of my mentors. Um, but at least for me, whenever arrogance has come up, and in the um, organizational psychology and coaching literature, I think this is called the bold derailer. Actually, that
Yeah,
um, it's one way of showing up when you're put under a certain kind of stress, whether it be social or otherwise, and it's like you know whatever, no one else's opinions matter. Whatever I have to say is the most relevant thing, or people aren't as smart as me, or I'll change the world. I'm
yeah,
this and that. People, right? So, there's a kind of grief, I think, that's inherent in that. At least
yeah,
for me, the grief of like not being related to on the terms that I find to be most important or valuable, and so not being loved for or seen for um, the way in which I admire or see myself as lovable. There's something like that embedded in there for me, at least.
I think that's right. I think that has to go towards uh, the idea of mentorship when you're mentoring somebody. What you want to do ultimately is you want to put people into a zone of proximal development that nevertheless is properly structured, it- so that they can internalize what's going on, so that eventually you, you become obsolete to them, at least as a teacher. Hopefully, like you, they become colleagues and coworkers, right? Uh, and so it's this fine balance you have to get, because you have to make yourself initially very valuable to the students, or why would they be giving you their time, right? If all you're doing is just being a conduit for some textbook or for your slides, then who cares? You've got to do something that's indispensable for them. But then you've got to do it so that eventually they don't need you anymore. And so that's the dance, right? That's the mentorship. You have to you have to make yourself valuable until they have internalized the values you exemplify, such that they don't need you anymore.
Okay, so this is great because we're at least for me, we're at a bit of a crossroads here. One of the things I actually wanted to ask you about is so I'll pose you these two possibilities, and you could tell us which way you'd like to go, or offer a third way. It doesn't matter.
Sure.
One, I was curious about because relevance realization is a central concept to your thinking and to
Yes.
your
Yeah.
theoretical and philosophical approach to the human condition.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about relevance realization and how that framework could be used for grounding a notion of human transformative experience.
Sure.
And then there's the other bit of I guess we've been taking this up from the point of view of a transformative teacher. In this case, you, and it's not far fetched to say that because that's something that you've been labeled like it's not a self identification. It's something that people have consistently said about you. So let's stick with that. But I'm curious from the perspective of a student, of someone who's learning, and I haven't had that many professors like you, and for a reason, right? And a lot of my own learning experiences have been kind of disappointing, at least like for me in the educational system. I guess what would be some like useful principles for students who grapple with feelings of disappointment or discontent towards their education, who nevertheless want to learn and want to engage in personal transformation and growth, should hold on to and be in touch with. So these are the two things that came up for me.
I want to talk about both of them. Let me do a third thing first, and then maybe that'll help me decide between them. I mean, see, the thing the thing is, I think you should. Here's the Socratic point. I think it's disingenuous to not give people your best take on things. To pretend that you are teaching things from some impersonal, godlike, third-person perspective is all. It seems, and this is something I'm quite critical of. It seems I find it pretentious. It seems to be humble, but it's actually often, very often, not always, it's very often a way in which the professor slips their particular answer or viewpoint into people's minds without ever saying that. So it's insinuated rather than proposed. That's what proposition meant, to propose, right? And I find that morally reprehensible. So often students are initially.
So would an example? I'm wondering an example of that. Would it be like somebody who says that they're not going to be bringing their personal opinions into their lectures, but they organize an entire course around a certain body of literature that represents their thinking.
Right, and the way they go through it, and so what you get is you get implicit argumentation by undisclosed selection, which is really, I think, I find that pernicious. So I'm upfront with people. This is going to be an argument. Because I'm not going to pretend that, because that's not how science works. We don't pretend that. We make an argument, we present it, and then we propose it, and other people counter-propose, and we discuss, and we debate, and we collaborate, and we compete, and that's how it works. And so stop the pretense that I somehow can put that aside when I'm in front of you. Instead, I'm going to make an argument, and I'm going to try and make it as best I can, and I'm going to revise it under criticism and comment.
That takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of courage,
perhaps, but I mean, that leads me to perhaps some advice I can give students is look for professors who bring these two things together, who make arguments, who are clear what their argument for, and then take on the responsibility of making good arguments, but are also fallible and self-corrective about those arguments. Right? So let's take relevance realization. All of the years I taught that, every time I taught that course, there were sometimes, relatively minor, sometimes significantly major revisions to my own thinking whenever I brought that topic up. I presented it because I think I've got good reason and good argument for it being a central way of talking about cognition. But on the other hand, you've proposed things about it. You've done that. And my attitude toward that was to be welcoming and to reflect upon it. And that's why we're working together, and you're proposing ways of extending it and revising it. That's what I mean. But you know what I stand for. You know where I am at, so you should know where I'm at, but you should also know that I'm always willing to listen. And I think students need to look for professors that exemplify that balance. I mean, I'm sorry,
So
that sounds self-aggrandizing, but that this is, for me, the important virtues are work here.
there's another interesting tension here that I'm detecting. It's one of the courage to sort of set your best foot forward, knowing that you might be wrong, you might be mistaken, and
Yes,
criticize to no end. But the maybe an implicit set or even an explicit sense of trust, right? Maybe even faith that if I were to do so, it's for the best because I am in good company.
yeah,
And so
yeah,
I,
yeah,
I wonder about how the kind of relationship that the teacher is able to facilitate, right, towards his or her students, um, and the function of the relationship as a container, right, to borrow to draw that analogy, I guess that metaphor, a container of trust to make encouragement possible, I guess, or
yeah.
I don't know how else to conceptualize it, but
No, I think that's right. I think it's trust, but it's not just trust in me, right? In fact, that's I should be exemplifying a process if they are able to
okay,
trust in, and that trust can grow incrementally as the course progresses, so that they start to get a sense of the process. Because what I mean, you know this from the work and the work of other people like Stanovich and others, right? People over-orient on the product to the exclusion of paying attention to the process, and that is one of the most powerful drivers of self-deception and irrationality. And if you get if you get people to and you do it and you bring up a product and like oh
okay.
this is how X works, and then you take it apart, but you take it apart in a way that's encouraging, and then they try to and they you shift their attention onto the process, and they
So
start to trust
what
it.
do you mean by product in this case, and what do you mean by process? Could we flesh that out a little bit?
So, I mean, well, let me be a little bit sloganistic, and then we'll shift it. Right?
Okay,
People fixate on their conclusions rather than on their questions and their arguments, right? And their argue well, and this is the whole problem with motivated reasoning, right? People, and this is, I mean, here's one of the quintessential things we need for rationality and distributed cognition. I have to be able to present an argument that leads to a conclusion opposite to a belief that you already have, and you're willing to change your belief because of that argument. But if you are always only constructing arguments back asswards, that here's my conclusion, and I'm going to only look at arguments that support that, right? And that I don't actually care about the process. I don't value it for its own sake. But if you can get people to be aware that process is where you train virtue, as opposed to just getting conclusions that give you fact.
okay.
If people can see the value of virtue and that the virtues are trained in process, then they will come to trust you because they start to get a sense of the virtue that they are starting to internalize, even though various beliefs that they were holding dear have been lost. That's the whole Socratic thing. That you come to know what you don't know, but not as some privation, as the realization that you can be bound to a process of the cultivation of virtue.
Okay, so this is making me think of people's relationship with anxiety, actually, because there's something about um, being put into, or even putting yourself into a position of not knowing that's inherently anxiety
Yes,
provoking, right?
yes,
Because of the uncertainty that it invites
yes.
into your field of experience. And um, uh, I guess what I'm hearing you say is that through what emphasizing process as opposed to product really means is transforming your relationship, your orientation towards your own anxiety.
Deeply.
Uh,
It is deeply insightful and astute because I mean
yeah.
this is sort of the core of Stoicism. There's two things you can do with uncertainty. You can try and render the world certain. Good luck. Good luck with that. And people try that. That's what all the ideological, bullshit and addiction is right now.
How
I'm
bad
gonna
how
make
bad does it get? Like, what are the worst? Like, what's the upper limit of that kind of that sort of totalitarian approach?
Well, it's a complete it's a totalitarian ideology in the sense that I have a set of unchanging ideas that will answer any question asked, give any advice that's needed, and require no further learning. All I have to do is adhere and hold them.
Do you think that maybe not all, but at least a good chunk of psychopathologies could actually be conceptualized in terms of like a kind of psychological totalitarianism.
I
Uh,
think
oh,
I
yeah.
think partially. I mean, I think there's also issues with salience dysregulation that are playing a crucial role.
Okay. Like
But but
psychotic. Yeah. Okay.
but I just wanted to finish, Gary. I
Yeah.
just want to
Yeah.
finish with, because there's the two prongs, right, to the stoicism is you can either try to render the world certain, or you can try and render yourself virtuous, right? And so that, right, you have the best, I mean, you have the best possible adaptivity, the best possible wisdom for whatever happens, and such that you can adapt to this standard, not a perfection standard, which means I'll win every situation or I will never die. That's ridiculous. But to this standard, which is that, right, I can adapt to this to the degree that I will actually not lose the virtues. So the very things that are making me adaptive become self-sustaining. That's where the security comes in. I have these virtues, and if I've cultivated them enough, I can respond to certainty so that those virtues will not be lost. I will not become a coward. I will not become a liar. I will not become somebody who's greedy or ridiculously self-centered.
To certainty or uncertainty? Sorry.
In the face of uncertainty.
Uncertainty. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
for example, let's take courage. Courage is in the face of uncertainty, right? Being able, nevertheless, to act for what is good, what is right.
Mm. Okay. So I think this would be a great segue to talk about relevance realization, specifically the
Yeah.
opponent processing approach, actually, as a
Okay.
way to
Yes. Yes.
cultivation. Yep. Yep.
Yes. Because I mean, so let's take the Aristotelian idea of what a virtue is. The
Okay.
Aristotelian idea is that a virtue is not some set like place. It's not like a Kantian rule.
Hmm.
What a virtue is, and I often use Alicia Araro's notion, but she deliberately bases her work on Aristotle, so it's not an imposition, right? That what you're doing, a virtue is a way of virtual engineering, right? Where what you're doing is creating a set of selective constraints and enabling constraints on your interaction with the world. Selective constraints reduce the options. Enabling constraints open the options up. And so Aristotle said, right, and I think that's the better way of understanding the golden mean, rather than as a mean, by the way, right?
That's
Aristotle
a
was
dynamical, evolving.
a dynamical virtual engine, yeah. So, I can have too much, right? There's virtues of excess, there's vices of excess. Like I have too much fear, and so I need a bunch of habits, constraints on what's possible to me,
Yep.
right? That limit that selective pressure. But but I can also suffer from a deficit of fear. I can be an idiot. I can be foolhardy. I can ignore other people's threat to other people because I have no fear. Somebody who had absolutely no fear would be a complete and utter asshole, right? So I need enabling constraints that make me pay attention to risk and threat and take it seriously. And what I have is I try to cultivate these habits. And what it's doing is it's right that the sensory motor loop with the world is constantly being bound. Just like, and I
Okay.
use this analogy, like evolutionary adaptation, right? Being well fitted to the environment, being adapted. How does evolution by natural selection work? Well, you have a feedback loop that's analogous to the sensory motor loop, and then you have selective pressures, right? You have scarcity, and then you have enabling pressures, variation in the species, in the population, and the variations open up the options, and then the selective pressures winnow them down, right? But then the environment changes, and then as
Right.
you go
Right.
like this, right, and it shifts around, and that's why it revolves with change. That's what evolution means.
So I like this. So go ahead. Go ahead.
But I was just going to say, relevant, but the virtues are higher order versions of what I just described. What I just described, I think, is ultimately the machinery of relevance realization. Because what we're
Okay.
constantly doing is we have cognitive processes that introduce variation and expand the variation, the amount and variability of the information available to us. And then they're locked in, right, with other processes that put selective pressure on them in terms of efficiency, right? And then what happens
Right.
is my sensory motor loop is constantly evolving to zero in on the relevant information. So virtues, in my mind, a higher order improvements, optimizations of relevance realization. And this is a Socratic thesis, I would argue,
Yeah.
because Socrates argued that each virtue, well, at least according to some people, and I agree with these arguments, each virtue is just a way of being appropriately wise in a particular situation. So to be wise in this situation is to be kind. To be wise in this situation is to be courageous. To be wise in this situation might mean a mixture of courage and kindness to the right degree. And so all I'm doing with virtue is optimizing and enhancing my relevance realization. And I propose to you that's ultimately what wisdom is.
That's okay. That's beautiful. Okay, so here's what I want to ask you. Can we do a bit of a phenomenology of this, actually?
Sure,
Because,
sure.
and I think what I appreciate about Jordan Peterson's work is actually that his conceptualization of the hero's journey in terms of, well, first of all, it's put in layman's terms in a sense. It's something like it's in life world language, right? It's
Yeah.
like find all those things. Just notice all the corners of your house that make you kind of withdraw and avoidant, and voluntarily do the opposite of that. Go, right?
Yeah.
Go, move towards the things that make you anxious, and in doing that, you might learn something new and transform yourself. And so I'm wondering if we could. So two things. First, the way you laid out relevance realization right now, it's from a third personal perspective. It's as a mechanism, right?
Yeah.
What I'm curious about is the first personal, maybe even the second personal side of it. Second, if it's, from the first person perspective, like, you never have a God's eye view as to what the right thing to do is. It's something that you have to, in some sense, discover or experiment and explore, right? Peterson gives this analogy of the North Star, right? Of uh, which is how he, I guess, conceptualizes one's own conscience, which is a fallibilistic sort of conception of conscience, right? Find the thing that shines forth to you most and captures your interest, and move towards it. As you move towards it, its position in the sky is going to change. So you're going to have to reorient yourself in a real time fashion as you continue to pursue it. In pursuing it, though, where you end up arriving might not be where you thought you were going to arrive at all at the very beginning of it. But in that process, you've cultivated your conscience, right? You've arrived somewhere worthwhile. So how does relevance realization fit in with that metaphor, which I think is a way of thinking about the hero's journey?
Okay, so I knew at one point I'd have to talk about Jordan. It seems inevitable. And I have a complex and good relationship with Jordan, but I mean we've shared students and we've argued at conferences, and so um, yeah, I don't really like the North Star metaphor. I get the idea. I get the idea that yeah, I agree with the part that it sort of, it draws you, but you end up, like people like will come to meditation because they want to relax. But I'll tell them once you've started meditating, the reasons for why you're meditating will change and become apparent to you, and that will keep happening to you. And the same thing like when you fall in love with somebody, why you're originally attracted to them, like that isn't why you stay with them, right? Right? Because it leads you to something you didn't know. And so that's why I tend to rely much more on L.A. Paul's work on transformative experience. She literally wrote the book on it. And Agnes Callard's book on aspiration, and the process of appreciation, the process by which we come to have a sense of self, and a sense of world that we don't currently have. She gives the example of, wanting to like classical music and like appreciate it. So you take a music appreciation class. And so why do I say the, the North Star is actually typically not there for people who are undergoing significant transformative experience. Um, and this is, I mean, this is Lori's work. I know Lori, L.A. Paul. Um, and she uses a Debunking experiment to try and get you to how transformative experiences actually work. And I want to mention this because this is actually, I think, very profoundly important for understanding cognition. I mean, Lori and then Agnes Keller picks up on it very well. But Lori's work in that book, I think, is like central. It needs to be more famous than it is. It's already famous. She's winning all kinds of awards. But more and more praise to L.A. Paul. Okay. So here's the debunking experiment. So your friends come to you and they give you indubitable evidence, an argument that they can do the following. They can turn you into a vampire. Should you do it? And L.A. Paul says, well, you face this problem. And this will get me into some of the other stuff I wanted to talk about, right? So normally when we face a choice, we try to be Bayesian. And what we do is we determine the probabilities, we determine the values of the utilities, we do the multiplication, and then we pick the one that has the greatest product. There we go. Very easy. Right. The problem with this is, right, you're actually in symmetrical ignorance. Because, and she says, you can have all kinds of propositional knowledge about vampires. You can even maybe have some procedural knowledge. You might know what it is like to sort of jump and maybe bite people and stuff like that. But you lack two kinds of knowing. I'm going to use some of my language, but she's okay with it because I've done it in her, and I think I've done it in her presence, right? You lack what I call perspectival knowing. You don't know what it is like, that here nowness salience landscaping of being a vampire, because you don't have that state of consciousness. You don't have that here nowness. And you also don't have the participatory knowing. You don't know what kind of self it is to be a vampire and what kind of world it is, right? You don't have that agent arena identity, right? And so you don't know what it's like to be a vampire. You lack the perspectival and the participatory knowing. So you don't know. You can't assign the probabilities, and you'll say, well, at least I can assign the values. No, you can't, because one of the things that's going to change in that transformation is exactly your scale of values and the values that you hold. There is no constant set across them. You can't infer or Bayes your way through it. Coder made this point ages ago when he talked about that you can't infer a stronger logic from a weaker logic. There is no inferential thing you can do to get new axioms.
I agree with that. Should I hold that for now, or
let me finish the argument.
Okay.
I've just finished the argument. So she says, and here's the thing: what I meant by symmetrical ignorance. You say, well, I won't do it, but you can't justify that because you don't know what you're missing.
Right.
And then you say, well, I'll do it. You can't justify it because you don't know what you're losing.
Right.
You can't assess your gains and losses.
Okay.
Right? And so, and then her point is, and you go, okay, who cares about being a vampire? And she says, and this is the point, every genuine transformative experience has that structure. Okay. If you're going to become a parent, if you're going to fall in love with that person, if you're going to take up that career, if you're going to move to that culture, you face these kinds of decisions. You'll have some propositional knowledge and some procedural, but none of that will work. There is no North Star. There is no North Star.
I see what you're saying. Okay, so I would argue against that actually, and I'm wondering what your thoughts would be here. I think the North Star is it's a meta ideal. It's not reducible to a propositional set of values or anything that's static.
So what's the meta ideal though?
So here's what it is. It's the meta ideal is a way of establishing a different kind of relationship with uncertainty, one that doesn't breed rigidity or complete chaos, but one that optimizes between the two. So what I mean by that is, and I actually tried this a few years ago when I adopted this way of thinking about things. I started to look for the things that would make me anxious deliberately, and to try to sit into them, not haphazardly, but intelligently, mindfully and gently, maybe even. And at first it was working out quite well. I was learning all sorts of things about myself that, wow, I'm more anxious in classrooms than I thought I was. If I pay more attention to people's facial expressions and their bodily language, that introduces more things to take into account and to relate with than merely engaging with the text, which is what I was doing, for example.
Okay, but then if that's the case, and that's what I was going to say. I mean, I think the Taoist metaphor is way better than the North Star metaphor. And the North Star metaphor says what is constant, because that's why it's the North Star, and what is always prominent and salient to you.
Okay.
But that's not what you just described at all. You described a willingness to, so you got the Taoist thing, which is, I
Okay.
don't know where I'm going at all. But what I'm going to do is going to make myself as adaptive as possible so I can flow with any situation as it arises or occurs.
Okay. Okay, I see what you're saying. I think the reason why I gravitated towards North Star metaphor is because it has a target that's identified, and I think the phenomenological target that we're working with during
Sure, sure.
transformative experiences is however uncertainty manifests itself, whether in the form of anxiety or interest or curiosity or flow, because these are varieties of uncertainty, right?
Well, it is. I mean, but it's not just uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
You're right. You have to have the relationship to uncertainty, but you also have to have. I mean, it depends what you mean by uncertainty, I guess, because there's also a meta value of. I think you're saying this, so that's why I'm hesitating, and I don't want to. I don't want to be imposing. So what I want to draw out from you, then, let me
Yeah, yeah,
rephrase it
yeah.
that way, is
Uh,
uncertainty. It's uncertainty is a privation, and we want to talk about. That's why I try to talk more about. You said the right relationship to uncertainty, and it sounds to me as soon as you say that, then I don't think there is such a thing as a single right relationship to uncertainty. That's what
which
I was
is,
trying to talk
yeah,
about
I
earlier.
agree, I agree, I agree. And I guess it's, I just don't know, don't have another way of talking about it. Maybe you can fill in these gaps, but it's like right mindfulness. There isn't really a right mindfulness as an end product. It's a process that you're supposed to
Well,
continually
yeah,
optimize, right?
and that's carried by the word right. It doesn't mean correct. It's not the right like the right answer. It's right-handedness. It's the ability to have the dexterous
It's
adaptiveness of the right hand. It's not correctness.
right,
Can
right. um, the thing that I was gonna say is,
can I say one more thing?
sure, sure, yeah, 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 yeah,
The reason why this matters
yeah.
is because, and this is why I am concerned. I understand what you're saying, so I'm not trying to slide beside it, you know,
Mm-hmm.
to sweep the argumentation. But I do hear, in fairness to me, many people interpret Jordan's work in terms, and he uses this language in terms of purpose. Set your purpose and work towards your purpose. And that's very non-Taoist, by the way. Taoists don't talk that way. And what the research is showing is purpose doesn't matter as much to us as we like to think it does. You know what matters most to meaning in life is mattering, which is the ongoing sense of being connected to something that has a value other than just your own egocentric concerns. Value and depth of experience matter more to meaning in life than
Yep.
purpose does. But now our culture is fixated on purpose. I think it's similar to the fixation on product rather than process. So that's why I want to challenge this. It's not just, it's just not just differentiating myself from Jordan. There's an issue here. There's an issue here that I want to address.
That's great. So, the way that's shown up in my practice so far, and I'll keep everything as anonymous as I can. I won't be violating any ethical regulations
Sure.
here. But what I can generalize is that, based on my little sample of experience, so maybe it's not generalizable, but I'm just going to assume that it is, that people who find themselves, you know, like down in the gutters, for example, psychologically speaking, depression or anxiety
Yeah.
or whatever, um, they, when I've asked them and questioned them for long enough about what it is that they want to do in life, vocationally or
Yeah.
romantically or whatever, ultimately they come down to saying something like, I want to do all sorts of things that I don't think I can or that I have in me
Yeah.
to do.
Yeah.
And I think that you're right, that the arrow is actually bidirectional in my mind. It's like all these purposes that you can set for yourself are markers of the kind of thing that you are, the worth, your existential worth, maybe your
Yeah.
lovability or something like that. And you
Yeah.
can't. It's like transjectivity. You can't separate two sides of the same coin. You can't
Yeah.
abstract them away from one another. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, you need purposes, I think, in order to cultivate your person into,
Yeah. So this
yeah,
is like
yeah,
James
and vice
Carson's
versa,
idea. This is
and
like
vice
James
versa. Yeah.
Carson's idea of the infinite versus the finite game, and Michael Apter's idea about paratelic versus telic, right? So you can compare. so in finite games, they have genuine purposes and they're finite because the point is to achieve a state that ends the project, right? It culminates, and that's the purpose of it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then you have what he calls infinite games, or what Michael Apter calls the paratelic mode, where the point is you set up like what look like goals or purposes, but the point is actually to keep the game going as much as possible. We're doing one right now,
Yep,
right?
yep.
We're doing one right now where we're trying, and what we can actually do, and why it's transformative, and this is Carson's point a little bit more clearly than Apter, I think, is we're actually what part of what we do with the game is actually change the rules by which we're playing the game as we're playing the game, um, and that's where we get the transformation. And so I think what I'm hearing you saying is if you can get people to realize that, like, obviously we have to work with like the having mode. We have to get food, we have to get water, all that.
Yeah.
But very often we set up goals not to achieve the goals, but so that we can get reliable feedback on how we're playing the infinite game of becoming the best person we can be. And right, and that should not have that should even though we're finite, that should not be a finite game because you should never say, and this goes back to humility. You know what? I'm honest. I'm done. I'm wise now. I'm done. I'm mature now. I'm done. You never get entitled, right? And Carr says that's the point of a finite game. The point of a finite game is you achieve the end state that says, I don't have to play it anymore because I have the title now, right? And so I can never stop playing the game of wisdom. I'm always going to be Philia Sophia. I'm always going to be a lover because I'm never going to be a god, right? And so if people can see that, if they can see and that the point of this is not achieving them, but providing basically what you do. Like you are basically a way of enacting feedback for them so that they can recalibrate their ability to come into that adaptive relationship. Does that sit okay with you?
Yes, 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 very much so. Um, hmm. I'm wondering at this point if it might be useful to sort of recap some of the main points, actually, what we've talked about, and see like what might be useful directions to take them in. And maybe if you'll be okay with it, I could like summarize what I've heard so far,
Please,
and like
please,
and
please.
get your feedback on it because it's important
Please.
too. So um, one metaphor that you borrow from Merleau-Ponty that I really like of optimal gripping,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
is central to
yeah,
relevance realization, the phenomenology of relevance realization is right. Anytime you're trying to solve or approach some sort of problem, you can potentially adopt varying opponent complementary strategies.
yep,
Like
yeah,
reading a book, for example, right? If you hold the book too close to your face, to your
yeah,
eyes, you
yeah,
can't see the text, and therefore you can't solve the problem of reading what's there
right,
and making sense of it. Likewise, if you're staring at the book from like 20 meters away, you
yeah,
also won't be
yeah,
able to.
yeah,
All things being equal, right?
yeah,
So the problem of reading a book is to be solved by finding that optimal distance between your eyes and the book.
right.
And all problems can be conceptualized in these kinds of terms as
Yes,
involving opponent strategies.
that's
And
right.
so a problem like, finding humility and steering away from arrogance it's a problem of optimal gripping,
Yes, yes,
right? Insofar as, how can I manifest myself in the fullest possible way that I can in this given context to facilitate learning and cultivate certain kinds of virtues, right?
yes, yes,
Rather than right come from a place of hesitation and anxiety and uncertainty
yes,
and
yes,
whatnot,
yes,
without disrespecting or dishonoring or trumping over others'
yes,
selves in the process.
yep, excellent.
For example, and this depends on context because
Of
one of the
course,
things that has made that a challenging problem for me is because I've gotten mixed feedback depending on the context, and
yeah,
that's made me reflective of the fact that optimal gripping is something that has to be done in real time rather than established a priori,
yes,
right?
yes,
Okay,
yes,
so relevance realization is optimal gripping,
right,
or the phenomenology of it is you're trying to find that golden mean, that golden middle,
yeah, that's
uh,
super.
so pay attention to feedback, see how things go, and I mean, there's no way to like box this all in because it's like it's inexhaustible. All the constraints and conditions that you always have to work with in real time. Um, but the other thing that I want to do was connect it to your point about finite and infinite games, and
Yes.
maybe that too is an optimization problem insofar
Oh,
as
yes.
what
Yeah.
you want to do is make the most of what you can with finite games.
Yes.
Be competitive, let's say, try to win, try to do all these things without compromising the infinite game too much. Right? And likely try to play the infinite game as best as you can without becoming a complete, I don't know, like an apathetic sort of, um, person with respect to the day to day, with respect to cultural and social values, for example, that need to be criticized or approached with a critical mindset, but can't be done away with altogether because of the utility that they offer us. So
Yeah, and that's now. Here's where I'm going to actually
yeah,
appreciate Jordan Peterson's work, and I've told this to Jordan in person. One of his better arguments, to my mind, and sorry, that sounds like a dismissive compliment. I meant it as a genuine.
mm,
Where he talks about metagaming, which is play any game so you don't destroy the ability to play games, right? And so the meta game is the infinite game of game playing. And we can't stop playing games because playing games, by the way, to go back to it, is how we actually solve L.A. Paul's problem. That's what I argue. That what we do is we play a game. We do symbolic enacted play. We go into a perspectival and participatory game that we play so that we can symbolically enact. We get a taste of what that other self and world might be like while we're still within this one, so we don't overcommit too soon. Play is exactly where we do that. And therapy, I think, is serious play. And
yes,
so, insofar as, right, we have to keep that, right, we have to keep playing the infinite game. That we play the finite games, but we never play them to the detriment of the infinite game of meta playing, because we recognize the fact that humans have to continuously undergo transformation. There are some truths that are only available in transformation, and that transformation always requires serious play. So we never engage our finite games such that the meta game of playing games gets shut down. That, I think, is one of Jordan's best arguments.
I really like that too. And as you said, psychotherapy is a form of play. I thought to myself, I guess playfully so, that psychotherapy is in some sense a form of playing with attachment and your
Yes,
relationship with attachment.
yes.
Um,
I think you're playing with a lot of things. I think you're playing with attachment. I think you're playing with, and these two are related. That's what Siegel's work shows. You're playing with attachment. You're playing with narrative identity, because Siegel's work shows that your capacity for autobiographical narrative is predictive of attachment, right? And so you're playing with those things.
mm,
And you're also playing with the machinery itself of
right.
relevance realization. You're playing with what Rusin calls the musicality of intelligibility, right? The music is just, we love music because it's serious play with our salience landscaping. It's an infinite game, right? And I think you're also doing that in psychotherapy. Yeah, I think there's all kinds of serious play going on there.
So one point of criticism. So I mean, if play is the meta telos, or I don't know how you would want to talk
Yeah,
about it, of transformation, or the condition that's necessary for genuine human transformation. Um, I'm thinking of this in terms of attachment, actually, insofar as like Harlow's monkey studies, right,
yeah, yeah,
with
yeah.
attachment. Um, we know that unless, and this generalizes to human beings too, actually, that unless um, a sufficient degree of a sense of security is in place, then
Sure.
exploration isn't the mode that you're likely to inhabit or to adopt with respect to your problems.
Yeah. You can only, and Apter talks about the same thing. You can't be in a paratelic mode if you're under threat, right? You have to have what he calls protective framing. But that goes back to what we were talking about earlier,
Right.
right? You
I,
have to, you have to create the framing, so that there, I mean, and that's,
I think the framing is an interesting, like it's a distributed cognitive process, though.
oh, it is. Yeah.
Largely, yeah.
I think it
Right.
has to, I, I, I mean, after it talks about a cognitive synergy, and this is why I think play is so important. It talks about cognitive synergies are places where we hold together two opposite identities. Let me give you an example, and it's deliberately a play example. So the child is playing with a toy sword. Okay, it's a sword that's not a sword, right? I do Tai Chi Chuan with a wooden sword, practicing, right? It's a sword that's not a sword. It's a sword insofar as it actually trains me how to use and what it's like. But it's not a sword in that it can't actually kill anybody, right? And so, right, cognitive synergies always have the not that is protective, but they have the is that's affording. And that's what I mean about serious play. Serious play has to get the optimal grip within the cognitive synergy that actually will afford what we're talking about.
So here's my hypothesis. I wonder what you would think of this. And since we're near the very end of our mark, well, this will be my last comment, or maybe not, knowing how I function. This as if quality that's necessary to right
Yeah.
for the feeling or the the protective function that you were just talking about. That it's a toy sword, right? I think what fulfills that function in the human context, or maybe even more broadly mammalian context, is secure attachments.
I don't know. I want to make it. I want to make it broader than that. I think. Oh, you mean just the safety function of it, or the whole cognitive synergy?
So, I guess the cognitive. So, you start off right, completely helpless as an infant, and
Sure.
over time, I think what happens is if you develop secure attachments with your parental figures, your caregivers, then you internalize patterns of secure attachment as patterns of enactment that you can then carry out with you into the unknown. And so it's not just an intersubjective distributed cognitive process, it gets internalized. But what
Yeah.
I find in the therapy process is that as therapists, we tend to act as the cloth mother for our patients. We're there as a temporary caregiver surrogate in a sense to soothe and help to calm and contain
Yes.
our
Yes.
patients' anxiety so that they can get the encouragement to confront the things that the monsters in their lives. So
I agree with that. I, I, I mean, that's sort of Maslow, right? I mean, your thing is called peak, so we should invoke Maslow at least once, right?
right.
Right. That I mean, you can't pursue, you know, self-actualization, and many people don't know that Maslow actually proposed something beyond that, which is self-transcendence, which is what I think we've been talking about all throughout today. Unless you have these lower needs met, totally, I totally agree with that. But for me, I have, I don't think this is I don't think this is a competitive proposal. I think that two could be made consistent with each other. I think, and Jung certainly thought this. So I'm in somewhat good company, I guess. Um, I think therapy actually, for me, what it is a surrogate for is religion. Because what religion does is it does these two things, right? It gives people a home, a sense of home, but it also exposes them to the numinous. And right? And if you don't have home, the numinous is horror. But if you don't have the numinous, home is prison, right? And you need home, so the numinous isn't horror, and you need the numinous, so home isn't prison, right? And
right.
what religion is about creating structures of practices that train religio, that relevance realization, that connectedness, that optimal gripping, so that we're always optimal gripping the sweet spot between home and horror, between the numinous and the sense of security. And so I think therapy is actually a surrogate for religion.
I will admit I'll have to sit with that and think with it and process it. That's really cool. That's really cool thought. It's really cool thought.
Yeah, Jung actually said, he famously said that if the religions were doing their jobs, he wouldn't have one.
Okay. That's really cool. Do you think that's a fair note to wrap up on?
I do. I like that. I like ending there. I think it's pretty good.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you for your time. I'm just gonna pause the recording now, and we'll have a few minutes to debrief, I guess. But
Thank
thanks
you.
again for
Thank
yeah.
you. I enjoyed this thoroughly. I found it one of my one of my running definitions, or at least criterion, for dialogos is that both people can get to a place they couldn't get to on their own. And that genuinely happened. I had a lot of stuff coming up that I hadn't actually articulated. So thank you.
Thank you, John. I'm glad to hear that. We'll maybe have another one in the future at some point. Thanks again.
Invite me whenever you want. I'd be happy to come back.
Sounds good. All right.